For the final nice part, we have Gerald More, who, as I said, had his flight cancelled, so he couldn't be here in person, regrettably, but who agreed to present by Zoom. So he's doing what we want him to do, but can't have all the fun. So that's really tough, but it's really nice of you, Gerald, to be here. Gerald More is professor of philosophy at Durham University, and he's chairperson of what's called the Collège Scientifique of the Institut de Recherche et d'Innovation, Centre Pompidou in Paris. Gerald explores, with an impressive range of theoretical ideas, the interfaces between ideas, technologies, and bodies, not least in questions of addiction, attention, and desire, all with a view to contributing to our understanding of climate change and the care crisis, and how we, as Anthropocene animals, can branch off or bifurcate from its ineluctable hamster wheel. My trajectory of learning from Gerald has only recently begun, emerging from my still peripheral participation in the academic communities with the center in Paris, who, largely inspired by the late Bernard Stiegler, are trying to develop a contemporary critical theory that meets the great challenges of our time, coming from the fusion of artificial intelligence with careless instrumentalism, and who are aware that for this we must cross disciplinary boundaries and learn from the traditions represented today by Paul and Katrine, as well as from the arts and from the activists such as those of the generation of Greta Thunberg. So, welcome, Gerald. Can't wait to hear what you're coming up with.
Thank you so much, Morten. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'm really pleased to be here. Very sorry that I haven't been able to make it in person. The reasons for that, I'm led to understand, reading between the lines, are less to do with the weather yesterday than the degraded state of Schiphol Airport. But anyway, let's push ahead as planned. I think probably I've attempted to write this paper more than I have done any other paper in multiple years. I'm not sure this is the one that I wanted to present. It's a bit loose and all over the place, but I just wanted to pick up on a few themes that I can elaborate on in turn. So I've given you the title of Motives and Quasi-Causes. I'll try and end up with a little bit on what we mean when we talk about quasi-causes. And it really picks up, you know, the key question of Morten's book, which I think is a really excellent book. The idea that we need meta-motives to drag us free, motives for transforming our motives. I'll choose to read that is, how do we motivate people to change their motives, to you know, how do we motivate the addict to want to end addiction, the anorexic to want to start eating, the patient to want to start taking their medication or reforming their lifestyle, and so on. And for me, this is really the kind of same question as the one that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari pose as the fundamental question of political philosophy back in Anti-Oedipus from 1971, where they say, you know, desire is the fundamental question of political philosophy. And coming at this as a political philosopher, you know, sorry, how do we motivate people to want to change a system that we know is making them miserable? How do we motivate ourselves to want to fix a climate crisis when we know full well that the ways of life that we're pursuing that are so detrimental to the planet are also overall detrimental to ourselves as well? We say that in view of record levels of burnout, addiction, white morbidity, so-called, and so on. Now, Morten pursues the answer to this question. Well, how do we motivate people to change their motives? Through the idea of texts as what, through Paul Stenner, we might call liminal affective technologies of care, which is to say that the texts serve as a kind of transitional object. When we pass through something like a phase of technological disadjustment or social environmental dislocation, the act of writing and indeed of reading can facilitate this movement between a state of entrapment or breakdown of previous routines and habits, and lead us into the reconstruction of something new, the construction of something new. And one of the implications of this idea is that texts, academic texts in particular, will be pharmaca, to borrow the term of Bernhard Stiegler, going all the way back to Plato, the idea that something is both cure and poison. So if we say that an academic text is both cure and poison, prototypically it can serve the work of therapy, but it can also set it back, especially, and this is, I think, one of Morton's targets here, especially if these texts can claim for themselves a level of objectivity that is detrimental to patient or subject-centered experience. And I wonder if we can read into it a kind of accusation, maybe putting it too strongly, but let's go with it, a kind of accusation of carelessness in the work of those texts that disengage from the complexities and multiple motives that may be at work in, for example, speculating into the motives and the causes of addiction. We get some really good examples in Morton's book. For example, the patient who feels alienation on surreptitiously reading her own medical notes. This would be just one example for the potential damage that is incurred when academic writing effectively seems to disengage from the intimacy, the lived experience of people whose work, who are effectively touched by this work. Now, I say all this because, and I joke with Morton over email, that he dismissed me as a charlatan. I'm one of these people who might seem to be disengaging from the lived experience of patients here or addicts. He was very adamant that I'm not a charlatan. I still like the idea of clinging to that title, albeit with perhaps a bit of pathological demand avoidance. But anyway, so we come back. I think one of the things that Morton's particularly concerned of with is the kind of neuroscientific writing that will enter into the fray of discussing motives, but does so without engaging with that lived experience of patients. And here he kind of turns his sights against the neuroscientific discourses surrounding addiction, surrounding dopamine in particular, where he, I think, absolutely rightly suggests that reference to this kind of popular and even not so popular neuroscience often tells us less than we get from the study of non-neuroscience, and functions primarily as a kind of performance of credentialization. So we quote here from the book: "We learn that dopamine is important, activated, and implicated, but nothing more specific. This vagueness of the contribution of neuroscience is quite typical, and another example of the pragmatic utopian power of boundary objectivity, as documented by Nicholas and others. The brain reference is ubiquitous in popular psychology, working through a mixture of scientific hype and alignment with soaring consumption of very blunt pharmaceutical instruments. Leading voices in all professions of care, therapy, and education have adopted this vague brain reference as a way of warranting their expertise. At times, the enthusiasm is even mirrored in critical theories of addiction as circumscribing an era of dopamining." That is a reference to me, Gerald More. But we could keep going here. The brain reference works or is believed to work, or it works because it's believed to work. The biological reference remains a purely abstract move of legitimation. I'm entirely happy to hold my hands up to that, but I also think that there is a little bit more to it. So if we come back to this idea of dopamining, what I mean when I talk about this concept is it starts off with the claim that we can reread the history of capitalism, and indeed further back than capitalism. If we look at the domestication of agriculture, its relation to wheat, paying workers in beer and the like, we can read it much further back to Neolithic times. But it's the idea that we can read the history of capitalism as organized around a series of intensifying habit-forming commodities, like not just wheat, but the spice trade, the sugar trade, tobacco, gin, by which we mean basically it's a reference to 17th, 18th technologies of distillation that dramatically increase the potency of alcohol. But we've also got the rise in coffee consumption, then opium, and I would add digital screens as a new kind of mechanism of delivery, where even fake news as well can be seen as linked to addiction. And the argument I've come out with is that we can read not just capitalism in terms of the production of those increasingly potent and targeted, I'll say addictogens, but I don't mean it really. I just mean things that we may be liable to consume pathologically. And the reason I think that we see, whether it's deliberate or not, capitalism pursue this line is because in no small part, these commodities will function to take the edge off, or in Kongiemian terms, to expand our margins of tolerance for the stresses and environmental dislocation that capitalism itself produces. You know, we now see this taken to a new level. I think for the most part, we couldn't claim this is done deliberately, even if paying workers in gin and beer has a very long tradition. Same for tobacco too. But we now see this becoming increasingly strategized, formalized in works of business strategy that talk about how to design for addiction, how to produce habit-forming products. There's a famous work by Nir Eyal called Hooked that works along these lines. And I guess the first question that we ask ourselves from this is does this, because again, when I come up with this theory, I'm not, except to say that we can read addiction as a response to a kind of consumerist response to environmental dislocation. I don't push further into the motives of users, which I fully recognize can be far more complex than I suggest. Now, the easy criticism to make of all this is that I'm at risk of trivializing addiction, and I note that Morton uses addiction in scare quotes quite frequently in the book. Am I at risk of trivializing addiction and its underpinning motives? Well, occasionally in the book, it can come across that may be the case. Equally, I'd suggest that one of my motives in recoursing to this language of addiction here is because it's a concept that has always been very heavily politicized. You know, if we trace it back to its 17th century origins of the term and even further, we start off with notions of good addictions, the addiction to God being foremost among them. The term only becomes increasingly pathologized over the last 100 years or so with the rhetoric of the war against drugs, but we still tend to see some addictions to work, to coffee insofar as it facilitates work, to exercise. By and large, we still tend to differentiate between the good addictions that don't get classed as addictions and the ones for a pathologized set of substances that tend to just redouble the extent to which certain groups are deemed part of the outside of society, the social underclass, and so on. So the first thing there is that I'd say, well, I may not be talking specifically about the motives of addicts, but I am looking more generally at the culture that may feed into generating addiction, and equally at ways that we might destigmatize what I think is a far, far more common pattern of behaviors than we give it credit for, than is frequently recognized. Now, we still come back. Well, why then? Is this the only justification for my recourse to a kind of simplified, crass language of neuroscience when I invoke the neurosciences and dopamine? Am I simply performing my credentialization there? Well, the first thing to say is that I started to move in this direction, one, when we wanted to get Bernard Stiegler, who Morton discusses extensively, when we wanted to get him accepted and understood in the Anglophone market, which has got simply no tolerance, especially at governmental levels, for the language of the libido and drives and the like. So a lot of it is simply pragmatic, switching into the language of the people that we felt needed to listen to us. But it's equally a change that I think was motivated in no small part precisely because of what Morton himself recognises as being the serious limitations of that Stieglerian Freudian language of libido and libidinal economy, where addiction is somehow linked to drives, which are to be opposed to, short-term cravings that somehow fail to meet this demand for sublimation, long-term planning that Stiegler would want to associate with desire. So I'm seeking to move away too from that language of drives and desire that Morton finds so counterproductive. I think it especially becomes, excuse me, counterproductive when we think, for example, about the way in which, for Stiegler, certainly desire takes on a kind of moral status and is linked to a set of supposedly morally superior activities. Reading books will generate, creating art and gardening will all generate desire and deep attention and focus, whereas watching television and going on social media will be entropic in the sense that they cultivate cravings and inattention. I think that this starts to get really messy when we move further into, I'm suspicious of medicalized discourses and indeed of psychological discourses, but we know, for example, that many people who sit and slump themselves in front of the TV at the end of the day aren't simply doing it as a way of refusing the prospect of negentropically participating in the creation of artworks and self-sculpting. It may well, in this case here, and I won't push further into the point, but it may well be that if you are autistic or have ADHD and have suffered a severe amount of dysregulation, it may well be that indulging in a bit of screen time is a way of releasing, allowing entropy back into an overly rigid and compressed mindset. We needn't kind of veer off into Jung on questions of mental entropy there. But anyway, the point there being that I share a lot of Morton's concerns around this Freudian language. I do wonder where, Morton begins with Gregory Bateson in the book and these metalogues. Bateson famously says of this concept of instinct that it's a black box that really just brackets off anything further that needs explaining. I do wonder here whether, and I think Morton may well say the same, even those very concepts of libido, drive, and desire are equally black boxed. And I do wonder too whether neuroscience offers us a way into doing that. I say this as I push a little bit further ahead. One of the things that Morton appeals to in his work is this concept of neurodiversity, neurodiversification. The idea that we need to broaden our tolerance, our acceptance of different kinds of discourse, of interdisciplinary work, of allowing certain kinds of experimentation that may function to diversify our range of intellectual stimulus here. I don't know whether, now it may well look, if we go back for a moment to my discourse around dopamining and neuroscience, it may well be that I am simply co-opting the language of the oppressor, of the institutional arts and humanities type delegitimators. I am open to that prospect, but equally, I thought it worth pointing out here that this concept of neurodiversification actually originates in neuroscience. How do I know that? Because it was me who invented the term back in 2014 and promptly had it borrowed by Bernard Stiegler. And this leads me to consider, well, one of the criticisms that Morton makes of neuroscience is that it simplifies. It tells us less about things like motives than we already know if we simply ignore it. Privately in an email, Morton has said to me, for example, that he thinks really the only positive to come out of neuroscience is drugs, and he's not at all disdainful of the success of a lot of those drugs, but he does wonder what else neuroscience might have to offer. Well, what do we mean by neurodiversity in this respect? So I came to it through a reading of this book by Mark Lewis, The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, where one of the key arguments that Lewis comes up with, and I think we can use it to make the claim ultimately that addiction is really nothing other than a certain kind of learning, and not even the kind of pathological learning of which some people speak, just learning. But Lewis talks around the idea that addiction will consist in this narrowing tunnel of attention where we increasingly focus on and are only able to be stimulated by a particular object to which we have an addiction, be it drugs, screen time, whatever, work even. And the way that this will lead in turn to neuronal pruning, weakening of synaptic connections between the bits that are no longer receiving motivated by stimulus. And he makes the suggestion here that rather than abstinence, which simply reinforces the very neuronal synaptic networks that strengthened around the object of addiction, Mark Lewis will say, well, abstinence has exactly the same effect of reinforcing these connections. And he kind of elliptically suggests that, well, maybe what we need to do then is rather than abstain, we simply need to expand our range, the range of environmental stimuli to which we expose ourselves, playing the piano, taking up running, all this kind of thing, learning a new language. And it was this that I kind of thought, well, if we're talking about diversifying the diet of stimulus to the brain here, can we equally see that working in terms of academic diversification too? I kind of want to put that aside. I'll leave that there. I want to end, though, on another idea that really kind of comes out of this, but which is already implicit in so much else too. One of the ideas that comes out of Bernard Stiegler too, briefly in 2013, he doesn't go back to it a great deal after that, is one he takes from the Stoics and from Gilles Deleuze, an idea of quasi-causes. And the Stoic roots of this term are in the idea of non-material forms of attraction. And for Stiegler, he'll take this to mean, well, the dominant form of immaterial attraction comes from the ability, the capacity to project alternative futures. And it's going to be the ability to construct and envisage alternative futures that exert that kind of attraction on us that will enable to break the hamster wheel, the tightening noose of attention around an object of addiction. Stiegler will describe this kind of causality coming from the future as a quasi-cause. And I think we can use that to see actually that across the history of philosophy, we've got a series of quasi-causes being thrown in here. The ideas in Plato are all about an object to which we can, an immaterial object, set of objects to which we can attach ourselves as a way of pulling ourselves out of corporeal temptation, bodily causality. It's the same with Kant's concept of transcendental subjectivity. We simply have a point of rupture that stands outside what he'll call the heteronomy of bodily desires and temptations. We see it too in the AA's belief, Alcoholics Anonymous belief in the somewhat but not exactly indeterminate concept of God. Now the question is, for me, how do we get from those ideas on quasi-causality to get back to Nissen and indeed Paul Stenner on this concept of the liminal affective technology of writing? And I do think here that there's a little bit of a theoretical gap in Morton's book. I wonder if we might fill in the gaps with something like Bernard Stiegler's theory of primordial narcissism. But the question for me would be, in practice, yes, I agree entirely, and we need to be led by practice here. We can see that the that the process of externalizing oneself in writing and reflecting on one's writing functions as a kind of therapeutic, curative way of leading us out from a broken set of routines and habits into something new. I still don't think the book takes us quite far enough in filling in theoretically what's at work at the level of affect when this is happening. Nonetheless, I think this is certainly more of a lacuna than a criticism, and I look forward to the opportunity to talk more about how we might start filling in the gap. All right, I better leave that there. I'm sure I've overrun, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Gerald. Really stuff for thought for me, for us. The ceremonial form is not that I answer any questions or, which is good because I haven't got yet. But I hope we can go on to discuss and find out how to fill in gaps and develop dialogues about it in the future. And this is really great, and I'm happy that we recorded it so that I can study again a little bit more in detail what was going on in your presentation. So thanks, and thanks for everybody of you for being here. Now we have the reception. We don't have a general plenary debate, but I hope we can go on discussing at least those of us who are present here in Copenhagen. So, okay, so thank you all for this.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Paul, Katrine, Gerald.